ground shook with each step the creature took. Annie Frost pressed herself against the overturned medical transport, her hands still gripping the supply kit she had managed to salvage before everything went wrong. Dust filled the air so thick she could taste it, and somewhere in that choking cloud something massive was breathing. She had seen war dragons before, but only in recordings. Everyone in the Galactic Relief Corps watched the footage during training, learning which battlefields to avoid and which species used what weapons. The Kryn Empire favored their bioengineered monsters above all else. Living tanks, some called them. Others had less polite names. This one was close. Too close. Annie had been a medical volunteer for 8 months. She treated burns and broken bones, delivered supplies to refugee camps, and tried not to think too hard about the politics behind each conflict. Her job was simple: help whoever needed it, regardless of which side they fought for. That philosophy had served her well until today, when her convoy took a wrong turn and drove straight into active combat. The other volunteers were dead. Annie had checked. She did not let herself think about their faces or remember their names. Not yet. Survival first, grief later. That was the rule. Through a gap in the twisted metal, she watched the dragon move. Its scales were deep red, almost black in places where old blood had dried. Scars covered every visible surface. Some wounds looked fresh, still weeping fluid that hissed when it hit the ground. The creature limped, favoring its left side. Something was embedded in its shoulder, a piece of shrapnel or broken weapon glinting in the fading light. The dragon stopped moving. Its head swung toward her hiding spot, and Annie felt her heart stop. Eyes like molten gold fixed on the wreckage. Steam rose from its nostrils. This close, she could see the intelligence in those eyes, the awareness. This was not just an animal, but it did not attack. After a long moment, the dragon turned away and continued its uneven path across the battlefield. Annie waited until the footsteps faded before she moved. Her training took over: check surroundings, assess threats, find safe route to extraction point. The problem was that extraction point no longer existed. The communications tower was slag. The emergency beacon in her kit blinked uselessly, unable to connect with any network. She was alone on a hostile world with no way home. The Kryn found her at dawn. Their patrol moved with military precision, weapons ready, scanning the wreckage. Annie stood slowly, hands raised, her medical insignia clearly visible on her vest. Shooting medical personnel violated at least 6 different galactic treaties, though she was not sure the Kryn cared much about treaties. Their commander was tall, even for his species. Kryn physiology favored dense muscle and thick hide, evolutionary advantages from their high-gravity homeworld. This one had decorations covering his armor, marks of rank and achievement. He looked at Annie the way someone might look at a minor inconvenience. "Human," he said in accented but clear standard language. "You are in restricted combat zone." "My convoy was attacked," Annie replied, keeping her voice steady. "I need to contact the relief corps." "That is not possible. You are now prisoner until your status is determined." He gestured to 2 soldiers who moved forward to take her arms. Annie did not resist. Resistance would be pointless. They brought her to a compound carved into a canyon wall. Temporary structures dotted the area, military efficiency evident in every placement. Soldiers moved between buildings with purpose. Equipment was stacked in precise rows. At the far end of the canyon, separated from everything else by a wall of energy barriers and guard posts, Annie saw him. The dragon from the battlefield. He was even larger than she had realized. His bulk filled the entire back section of the canyon. Heavy chains secured his legs to anchor points drilled deep into rock. More chains wrapped his neck and torso. He lay still, his breathing labored and painful to hear. "That is Drathis," said a voice behind her. Annie turned to find a Kryn medic, identifiable by the green markings on his uniform. The Crimson Storm, greatest war dragon in the fleet. Or he was until he went mad. "Mad?" Annie asked. "He attacks anyone who approaches. 3 handlers dead, 7 wounded. We cannot treat his injuries. We cannot mount him for combat. Commander Torn wishes to destroy him, but High Command refuses. Too valuable, they say." The medic shook his head. "Valuable corpse, more like." Annie looked back at the dragon. Even from this distance, she could see the infection spreading across his scales, the unnatural angle of one wing, the way he held himself against the pain. No wonder he attacked. He was suffering, and everyone who approached him either wanted to use him or gave up too quickly to help. "What happened to him?" she asked. 20 years of warfare happened. Drathis has fought in 43 major campaigns. The modifications we make to war dragons are extensive. Sometimes the body breaks down, sometimes the mind does. The medic studied her with curious eyes. "Why does a human care?" Annie did not answer. She watched Drathis shift position slightly, a movement that clearly cost him effort. His golden eyes opened for a moment, scanning the compound before closing again. She was a prisoner here with no way home and no way to help herself. But maybe, just maybe, she could help someone else. The idea was probably stupid. It was definitely dangerous. Every logical part of her brain said to keep her head down and wait for diplomatic channels to secure her release. But Annie had never been particularly good at listening to logic when someone was suffering in front of her. She would need supplies. She would need time. Most of all, she would need patience. Nobody climbed the war dragon. Maybe that was the problem. Annie spent 3 days watching before she made her move. The Kryn had assigned her to their medical bay, a practical decision since they were short on trained personnel. She cleaned wounds, mixed medicines, and learned which injuries the Kryn considered serious versus which ones they expected soldiers to ignore. Their pain tolerance was impressive. Their bedside manner was non-existent. Between shifts, she observed Drathis. The guards changed every 6 hours. Their patrol patterns were predictable, designed more to keep others away from the dragon than to keep the dragon contained. Those chains would hold him regardless. At midnight, there was a 15-minute gap when the night patrol took their meal break simultaneously. Poor discipline, but it worked in her favor. Drathis slept in short cycles, never more than an hour at a time. His breathing hitched on every third inhale, suggesting broken ribs that had healed incorrectly. The infection on his left shoulder had spread, discoloring the scales around it. Without treatment, it would eventually kill him. Annie gathered supplies slowly, carefully. Antiseptic from one cabinet, bandages from another, a surgical kit that she signed out under the pretense of inventory checking. The Kryn medic who had spoken to her earlier, whose name was Roth, noticed her interest in the dragon but said nothing. Maybe he thought she was just curious. Maybe he did not care what a human prisoner did with her free time. On the 4th night, Annie made her approach. The canyon was dark except for scattered light posts. Drathis lay in his usual position, head resting on his forearms. His eyes were closed. Annie moved slowly, making no attempt to hide her footsteps. Silence would seem like deception. Better to be honest about her presence. She stopped 20 feet away and sat down. For a long time, nothing happened. Annie waited, her supply kit beside her, her hands empty and visible. Wind moved through the canyon, carrying the smell of stone and the distant ocean. Her grandmother used to say that patience was the hardest skill to learn. Annie was starting to understand what she meant. Drathis opened one eye. It fixed on her with that same terrible intelligence she had seen on the battlefield. Annie did not look away. She did not reach for anything. She just sat. "Hello," she said quietly. "My name is Annie. I know you probably do not understand me, but I wanted to introduce myself properly." The dragon's eye narrowed. Steam vented from his nostrils. Still, Annie did not move. "I am not going to hurt you," she continued. "I am not going to try to ride you or chain you or use you for anything. I just thought maybe your shoulder hurts and maybe you would like someone to help with that. No pressure. I can just sit here if you prefer." Her grandmother had taught her dozens of old songs, melodies from Earth, that predated space travel and alien contact. Annie had always loved them for their simplicity. She began to hum one now, a lullaby about stars and sailing ships and coming home. Her voice was nothing special, but the tune was gentle. Drathis shifted. The chains rattled. Annie kept humming, kept sitting, kept her hands in her lap. An hour passed. Then another. Annie's legs went numb. She ignored the discomfort. Drathis watched her the entire time, sometimes with both eyes, sometimes with one. He did not sleep. Neither did she. When the first hints of dawn colored the sky, Annie stopped humming. "I am going to come back tomorrow night," she said. "Same time. You do not have to do anything. I will just be here if you want company." She stood slowly, picked up her kit, and walked away. Every instinct screamed at her to look back, to check if the dragon was reacting. She did not look back. The next night, she returned and sat in the same spot. This time, she hummed different songs. Drathis watched. On the 3rd night, Annie moved 5 feet closer before sitting. Drathis tensed but did not react violently. Progress. By the 7th night, Annie sat close enough to touch the dragon's scales if she reached out. She did not reach out. Instead, she talked. She told him about Earth, about oceans and forests and cities. She told him about her grandmother who raised her, about learning medicine, about the first time she saw a planet from orbit. Her voice was the only sound in the dark canyon except for their breathing. Drathis made a sound. It was low, almost subsonic, a vibration Annie felt in her chest more than heard with her ears. Not quite a growl. Something else. Communication, maybe. "I know," Annie said, though she had no idea what the sound meant. It must be difficult. She opened her supply kit and slowly removed the antiseptic. Drathis's eyes followed her movements. "This might sting a bit," Annie warned, "but it will help with the infection." "May I?" She waited. Drathis did not move. Taking that as consent, Annie carefully approached the infected wound on his shoulder. Up close, the damage was worse than she thought. The infection had eaten deep into the tissue beneath the scales. Embedded in the center was a broken blade, part of a Kryn weapon lodged at an angle that made natural healing impossible. Annie worked slowly, narrating each step. She cleaned the area first, removing dried blood and dead tissue. Drathis rumbled again, his muscles tensing, but he did not pull away. The blade would be the hard part. It was lodged between scales, buried deep. "This is going to hurt," Annie said honestly. "I am sorry. I will be as quick as I can." She gripped the exposed end of the blade with her surgical tool and pulled. Drathis roared, a sound that echoed through the canyon and brought guards running. Annie ignored them, focused completely on her task. The blade came free with a gush of infected fluid. She dropped it and immediately flushed the wound with antiseptic. Guards surrounded her, weapons raised. Annie paid them no attention. She packed the wound, wrapped it with bandages that would never hold against Drathis's bulk but might provide some compression, and finally sat back. Drathis breathed easier already. His golden eyes met hers and something passed between them. "Understanding, maybe? Or trust, same time tomorrow?" Annie asked. The dragon lowered his head to the ground and closed his eyes. Annie took that as a yes. Commander Torin stood at the edge of the barrier watching the human work. 3 weeks had passed since Annie's first unauthorized contact with Drathis. 3 weeks of gradual, impossible progress. The war dragon that had killed 3 trained handlers now allowed a slip of a human girl to climb across his back, treating wounds that would have festered into death. "Explain this," Torin demanded of Roth, who stood beside him with a data tablet displaying Drathis's vital signs. "I cannot, Commander. By all logic, it should not work. Yet the dragon's infection markers are down 40%. His appetite has returned. Yesterday, he allowed her to set the fracture in his wing." Roth scrolled through medical readings. "Whatever she is doing, it is effective." Torin watched Annie extract another piece of shrapnel from between Drathis's scales. The dragon rumbled, that strange sound he made only around her, not pain, something closer to communication. "Can we replicate her methods with our handlers?" "We have tried. Drathis becomes violent the moment anyone else approaches. It is specific to the human. That is unacceptable. Drathis is military property. We cannot have a foreign prisoner as his sole caretaker." Torin made a decision. "Tomorrow we test whether the dragon will accept combat commands from her." Annie learned about the plan when guards came for her during the morning meal. They did not explain, just escorted her to the command center where Torin waited with his senior officers. Maps covered the walls, tactical displays showing troop movements across the contested territories of Ashfall Ridge. "You have done well with Drathis," Torin began without preamble. "The dragon is operational again thanks to your efforts. Now you will ride him in combat." Annie's stomach dropped. "I am a medic, I do not fight. You are a prisoner who has been given considerable freedom in exchange for your cooperation. That cooperation now extends to military application." Torin gestured to the maps. 3 days from now, there will be a major assault on enemy positions. Drathis will participate, you will guide him. And if I refuse? Then you are no longer useful. Neither is Drathis. Torin's expression did not change. "We will destroy the dragon and process you through standard prisoner channels. You may eventually return to your people assuming diplomatic negotiations succeed. Drathis will simply be dead." It was not really a choice. Annie understood leverage when she saw it. "I will not attack anyone," she said firmly. "If I ride Drathis, it will be for rescue operations only. Medical evacuations, recovery of wounded soldiers. From both sides," she added, watching Torin's face. "I am a medic. That is what I do." Torin considered this. Several officers muttered objections, but he silenced them with a raised hand. "Acceptable. A flying medical platform has strategic value, but you will follow command structure and designated flight paths. Deviation will be considered hostile action." The next 2 days passed in intensive preparation. Annie learned basic flight commands from Kryn dragon handlers. Though she suspected Drathis would ignore most of them, she studied battlefield layouts and memorized radio protocols. Most importantly, she talked to Drathis constantly, explaining what was about to happen and what she needed from him. The dragon listened. His golden eyes tracked her movements as she walked around him, showing him maps and describing the mission. Annie had no idea how much he actually understood versus what he picked up from her tone and body language. But she talked anyway, building on the trust they had developed. On the morning of the operation, Annie climbed onto Drathis's back for the first time with purpose rather than treatment. The scales were warm beneath her, almost hot. She found handholds where spikes rose from his spine and settled into a natural groove between his shoulder blades. This close, she could feel his heartbeat, massive and steady. "Ready?" she asked quietly. Drathis' answer was to stand. The chains that usually held him had been removed. For the first time in years, he was free to move. His wings spread, each one as long as a small transport ship. The soldiers nearby scrambled back. The flight was beyond anything Annie had imagined. Drathis launched into the air with power that pressed her flat against his back. The compound fell away below them. Wind screamed past her ears. She gasped for breath in the thin upper atmosphere before Drathis leveled out, his flight becoming smooth and controlled. Below them, the battlefield spread like a map made real. 2 armies clashed across broken terrain, weapons fire creating patterns of light. Annie felt sick watching it, knowing each flash represented someone dying or being hurt. The radio in her ear crackled with commands, directing her toward a Kryn position taking heavy fire. Wounded soldiers needed extraction. Annie leaned forward, pressing her hand against Drathis' scales in the signal they had practiced. The dragon banked, diving toward the coordinates with frightening speed. They landed in chaos. Explosions, screaming, the smell of burnt flesh and ozone. Annie slid from Drathis' back and ran toward the wounded, her medical training overriding her fear. She worked fast, stabilizing the worst injuries while Drathis provided cover simply by being there. Enemy forces held their fire, uncertain how to react to the legendary Crimson Storm appearing in their midst but not attacking. Annie loaded 3 wounded soldiers onto a harness rigged to Drathis' back. As she worked, she saw more injured beyond the Kryn lines, enemy soldiers bleeding out in the dirt. Her people, in a different sense, people who needed help. "Commander," she spoke into the radio, "I have wounded hostiles in view, requesting permission to extract." Silence. Then Torin's voice, tight with disapproval. "Negative. Complete your mission and return to base." Annie looked at Drathis. The dragon looked back at her with those knowing eyes. She thought about what was right versus what was ordered. She thought about why she became a medic in the first place. "Negative, Command. Medical oath supersedes military orders. I am extracting all wounded." She switched off the radio before Torin could respond. It took 4 more trips. Annie and Drathis pulled wounded soldiers from both sides out of the combat zone, treating them equally regardless of which army they served. By the end, even the enemy troops had stopped shooting at them, some actively signaling for medical assistance. When they finally returned to base, Torin was waiting with armed guards. His expression promised consequences. But he was not the only one waiting. Word had spread. Soldiers lined the canyon walls, watching in silence as Annie climbed down from Drathis' back, exhausted and covered in blood that was not her own. "You directly violated orders," Torin said. "I saved 17 lives today," Annie replied. "That is my job." What happened next surprised everyone, including Torin. One of the soldiers began a slow clap, then another. Within moments, the entire compound echoed with applause. Even some of Torin's own officers joined in. The commander's face remained impassive, but Annie saw the calculation behind his eyes. Public opinion had shifted. Punishing her now would create problems. "Debriefing in 1 hour," he said finally. "Dismissed." Annie returned to Drathis' side and leaned against his warm scales, suddenly shaking with exhaustion and reaction. The dragon's head lowered beside her, and she felt more than heard his rumbling approval. They had done something today, something that mattered. And somehow, impossibly, both of them were still alive. The sunset painted Drathis' scales in shades of copper and gold, as Annie cleaned and dressed his wounds after another rescue mission. 6 weeks had passed since her first flight. 6 weeks of impossible partnership. Soldiers on both sides of the conflict had started calling them the Mercy Wing. When Drathis appeared in the sky, fighting slowed. Sometimes it stopped entirely. Annie felt the change in him before she saw it. A tremor ran through his body, different from the usual muscle tension. His breathing shifted. Then images flooded her mind, vivid and terrible. She saw through Drathis' eyes, but younger eyes. Saw a world of floating islands and crystal blue skies. Saw others of his kind, smaller dragons in colors of green and violet and silver playing in updrafts. Saw armed figures arriving, nets and weapons, capturing hatchlings while parents screamed overhead. The vision ended as abruptly as it began. Annie found herself gasping, tears streaming down her face for reasons she did not fully understand. The emotions lingered, powerful and raw. Loss, grief, betrayal. "They took you," Annie whispered, her hand pressed against Drathis' scales. You were just a baby and they took you. The dragon made a sound she had never heard before, something between a whimper and a growl. Annie realized with shock that Drathis was crying, or the dragon equivalent. Heavy drops fell from his eyes, hissing where they struck stone. She spent that night beside him, not treating wounds but simply being present. Drathis shared more memories. Annie saw years of training, of pain, of modification surgeries that changed his body and mind. Saw battles where he killed because that was what he was forced to do. Saw handlers who beat him when he hesitated and rewarded him when he destroyed. By dawn, Annie understood. The Kryn had not just enslaved Drathis. They had broken something fundamental in him, and then expected the broken pieces to function like a machine. She found Roth in the medical bay preparing for the day's work. I need access to the genetic records, Annie said without greeting. For the War Dragon program. Roth looked up, surprised. Those files are classified military research. I know what they did to him. To all of them. I need to understand the modifications so I can help reverse them. Reverse them? Roth's expression shifted to concern. That would be treason. The War Dragons are strategic military assets. Their value lies in their enhancements. Their value lies in being living creatures who deserve basic dignity, Annie shot back. You have seen what Drathis becomes when he is treated with basic respect. Imagine what he could be without the modifications causing him constant pain. Roth said nothing for a long moment. Then he sighed. I cannot give you access, but I also cannot monitor every terminal in this facility. If someone were to use my login credentials during my lunch break, I would have no way of knowing. He wrote a code on a slip of paper and left it on the desk. Annie spent her lunch break reading through files that made her physically ill. The modifications were extensive and brutal. Aggression enhancements that kept dragons in a state of perpetual fury. Pain suppressors that masked injuries until they became critical. Loyalty programming that punished independent thought. Growth accelerators that pushed their bodies to unsustainable sizes. And there, buried in the technical specifications, Annie found something else. A genetic facility on Ashfall Ridge where new dragons were being created and where the original breeding population was kept. Coordinates, security protocols. Everything she needed. That evening, Annie met with Owen Wells, the other human prisoner who worked in communications. They had spoken occasionally, carefully, knowing guards monitored most conversations. Now they stood in a maintenance corridor that Owen had identified as having no surveillance. I need your help, Annie said. Owen studied her with tired eyes. I know that look. That is the look of someone about to do something catastrophically stupid. I am going to free the War Dragons. Yeah. Catastrophically stupid, called it. Owen ran a hand through his hair. Annie, even if you could access the facility, even if you could release them, where would they go? The Kryn would just recapture them. Not if we disable the control system simultaneously. Not if we show the other dragons what I showed Drathis, that they can choose something different. Annie pulled up the files she had copied. Look at this. The control system uses a neural network. Every dragon is connected. If I can broadcast Drathis' memories through that network, show them what happened, show them his freedom, they will rebel all at once. Owen finished the thought. That would be chaos. People would die. People are dying now. In a war that uses enslaved creatures as weapons. How is that better? Owen was quiet for a long time. Finally he nodded. I can get you into the communication systems. I can maybe create a distraction. But Annie, if this goes wrong, they will execute both of us. You know that, right? I know. Planning took another week. Annie memorized layouts, schedules, guard rotations. She gathered supplies, hiding them in her medical kit. She prepared Drathis, explaining what she needed from him. The dragon understood. She could feel his eagerness through their connection, the desperate hope that other dragons might experience what he had found. The night they chose was moonless and cold. Owen created his distraction exactly as planned, a false alarm about enemy aircraft that pulled most guards to defensive positions. Annie and Drathis moved through the darkness toward the genetic facility, flying low to avoid detection. The facility was smaller than she expected, but heavily fortified. Drathis could have destroyed the walls, but that would alert everyone. Instead, Annie used access codes Owen had obtained through careful hacking. The door opened. They slipped inside. The breeding chamber was a nightmare made real. Dragons in cages barely larger than their bodies, subjected to constant testing and modification. Some were young, still showing colors from their homeworld. Others looked ancient, their scales dull from captivity. All of them turned to stare as Annie and Drathis entered. Annie worked fast. She connected Owen's modified device to the neural network terminal. The code he had written would broadcast Drathis' memories to every dragon connected to the system. Every war dragon on Ashfall Ridge, every dragon in this facility. All of them would see what freedom felt like, what choice meant. Ready? Annie asked Drathis. The dragon lowered his head, touching it to the terminal. Annie activated the broadcast. What happened next would be talked about for generations. Across Ashfall Ridge, war dragons stopped following orders. Some simply froze in place, overwhelmed by the flood of new information. Others broke their handlers' control violently, throwing off riders and smashing restraints. In the facility, caged dragons began to roar, a sound that built until the walls shook. Annie released the cage locks. Dragons poured out, disoriented but free. Alarms screamed. Automated defenses activated. Annie threw herself onto Drathis's back as the facility erupted into chaos. They flew through weapons fire and explosions, Drathis leading a stream of freed dragons into the night sky. Behind them, more dragons rose from across the battlefield, converging on Annie's signal. The sky filled with wings and roars and the promise of something new. 53 dragons answered the call. 53 creatures who had known only war now flew together toward an uncertain future. And at the front, a quiet human girl held tight to her friend's scales, terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. The rebellion had begun. Space was colder than Annie expected. Even inside the stolen Kryn transport ship, wrapped in thermal blankets with 53 dragons crammed into a cargo bay designed for 20, the cold seeped through everything. Drathis lay beside her, his body heat the only thing keeping her from freezing. Other dragons huddled together, their eyes reflecting confusion and fear and hope. The escape from Ashfall Ridge had been brutal. Not all the dragons made it. 7 fell to anti-aircraft fire before they cleared the atmosphere. Another 3 were too injured from their captivity to survive the stress. Annie still saw their faces when she closed her eyes, still heard their final cries, but 53 survived. 53 dragons who Owen had helped load onto a transport while the Kryn military dealt with a base in chaos. Owen himself had not made it aboard. The last Annie saw of him, he was being dragged away by security forces. She owed him everything. She owed him her life and the lives of every dragon on this ship. "Coordinates locked," called a voice from the cockpit. Beth Chen, a human pilot who had been held prisoner for 2 years and saw her chance at freedom in the chaos. She was not military, just a cargo hauler who took a wrong contract and ended up in Kryn custody, but she could fly and that was all that mattered. "How long until we reach the coordinates?" Annie asked. 14 hours at current speed. "Assuming we are not intercepted." Beth glanced at her sensors. "I am picking up pursuit ships launching from Ashfall Ridge. They are not close yet, but they will catch us if we maintain this heading." Annie looked at Drathis. The dragon's eyes met hers and she felt his thoughts mixing with her own. Calm, trust, home. He had shown her the coordinates in his memories, the location of his birth world. The place that Kryn took him from 40 years ago. "We keep going," Annie said, "no matter what." The 14 hours stretched into eternity. Dragons grew restless in the cramped space. Some of the younger ones cried out, distressed by the unfamiliar environment. Annie moved between them, treating injuries, offering what comfort she could. She used the last of her medical supplies on a green dragon with a shattered wing, knowing it might not be enough. The Kryn pursuit ships gained steadily. Beth pushed the transport to its limits, but the military vessels were faster, better armed. By the 12th hour, weapons fire began striking their shields. "We are not going to make it," Beth said. "Shields are at 30%. I can maybe keep us intact for another hour before they board us." Annie refused to accept that. Not after everything. She returned to the cargo bay and pressed her hand against Drathis's scales. "I need to try something. Trust me." Closing her eyes, Annie reached out through the connection she shared with Drathis. She felt his consciousness, vast and old and scarred but healing. She felt the other dragons too. Their minds linked through the neural network the Kryn had installed. That network was meant for control. Maybe it could be used for something else. Annie pushed her thoughts outward, sharing not just with Drathis but with all of them. She showed them her memories of Earth, of freedom, of what family meant. She showed them Drathis's memories of his homeworld, the place they were trying to reach. Most importantly, she showed them hope. The dragons responded, their minds connected with hers, creating something larger than any individual. A collective consciousness born not from control but from choice. And through that connection, Annie felt something incredible. She felt their homeworld calling them back. "Beth," Annie said, her eyes still closed. "Adjust heading. The dragons know the way." "Annie, you are not making sense. Dragons cannot navigate hyperspace. Trust me, please." Beth made the adjustment. The moment she did, Annie felt rightness settle through the collective consciousness. The dragons knew where they were going. They had always known. The Kryn coordinates were close but not exact. This path was true. The pursuit ships followed, still firing. One blast got through the failing shields and tore a hole in the hull. Pressure dropped instantly. Beth scrambled to seal the breach while Annie held on to Drathis, both of them struggling for air that was escaping into vacuum. Then something unexpected happened. The green dragon Annie had treated, the one with the shattered wing, began to glow. Faint at first, then brighter. A bioluminescence spreading across its scales. One by one, the other dragons began to glow too. Different colors, blue, violet, silver, gold. The cargo bay filled with light. The transport ship began to move faster. Much faster. As if the dragons themselves were propelling it. Beth stared at her instruments in disbelief. We are accelerating past maximum velocity. That should not be possible. Maybe war dragons can do more than fight, Annie said. Maybe the Kryn never let them discover what they really are. The light intensified. Space itself seemed to bend around them. The Kryn ships fell away, unable to match their speed. Annie felt the collective consciousness of the dragons singing. A sound without words that spoke of joy and power and homecoming. When the light faded, they had arrived. The planet before them was beautiful beyond description. Floating islands drifted through clouds of bioluminescent mist. Crystalline structures caught the light of twin suns, and rising from the surface to meet them came dragons. Dozens of them, hundreds, all colors Annie had no names for. Free dragons who had never known chains. Verdant Deep, Beth whispered, reading the name from scanners. That is what they call it. Drathis made a sound Annie had never heard before, pure joy. The cargo bay doors opened and dragons poured out into the atmosphere of their homeworld. Some flew awkwardly, their bodies too modified by Kryn engineering. Others soared with natural grace, remembering what they had lost. Annie watched them go, tears streaming down her face. This was why she became a medic. Not to patch wounds so soldiers could return to battle, but to heal the damage that never should have been done in the first place. Drathis remained beside her, even as other dragons called to him. He looked at Annie, a question in his golden eyes. Go, she said. It is okay. You are home. The dragon touched his head to hers gently, sharing one last moment of connection. Then he spread his wings and launched into the sky, joining his people for the first time in 40 years. Annie stood at the open cargo bay door, watching dragons dance in alien skies, and felt something break and heal simultaneously in her chest. They had done it. They had actually done it. Rain fell softly on the floating islands, warm and gentle, carrying the scent of growing things Annie had no names for. She sat on a platform of living crystal, watching young dragons play in the waterfalls that connected one island to another. 6 months had passed since they arrived on Verdant Deep. 6 months of healing and learning and building something new. The elder dragons had welcomed the returned exiles with open wings, but integration proved harder than anyone hoped. War dragons bore modifications that could not be fully undone. Their bodies were too large, their instincts too warped by genetic tampering. Some struggled with aggression they could not control. Others suffered from pain that medicine could only dull, never eliminate. Annie had worked herself nearly to exhaustion those first months, treating injuries and mediating conflicts and teaching others what she had learned with Drathis. Beth helped, along with 3 other humans who had been part of the Galactic Relief Corps before capture. Together, they established a healing sanctuary on one of the larger islands, a place where war dragons could recover at their own pace. The galactic community had responded to news of the escape with predictable chaos. Some species condemned the Kryn war dragon program. Others defended it as legitimate military research. Diplomatic channels buzzed with accusations and demands. The Kryn Empire initially threatened invasion to reclaim their property, but public pressure forced them to back down. Slowly, reluctantly, reforms began. Annie barely followed the politics. She had more immediate concerns. Like the silver dragon who still woke screaming from nightmares. Like the violet one who refused to eat. Like Drathis who spent hours every day flying alone to the farthest islands, processing decades of trauma in whatever way dragons processed such things. You should go home, Beth said one evening as they prepared the clinic for the next day. Back to Earth. You have done everything you could here. I know, Annie replied, organizing medical supplies. The Relief Corps has been asking when I am returning. They have new assignments waiting. But, Annie looked out at the sunset painting the sky in colors Earth never had. I am not sure where home is anymore. Footsteps behind them too heavy to be human. Annie turned to find an elder dragon, her scales the deep blue of ocean depths. Her name was Whisper of Tides, or that was the closest translation Annie could manage. She had been one of the first to welcome them. The young ones ask for you, Whisper of Tides said in the clicking, harmonic language of her people. Annie had learned enough to understand basic communication. They wish to show you something. Annie followed the elder to the playing grounds where young dragons gathered. These were true younglings born free on Verdant Deep. never knowing chains or modification. They played with an energy the war dragons still struggled to feel. When they saw Annie, they rushed over, chirping excitedly. The smallest, barely larger than Annie herself, tugged at her sleeve with careful claws. He led her to a shallow pool where something remarkable grew. Flowers, if they could be called that. Crystalline structures that chimed softly in the breeze and glowed with internal light. The younglings had arranged them in a pattern, and it took Annie a moment to recognize what she was seeing. Her name, written in standard letters with alien flowers. A gift? Thank you, Annie said, her voice thick with emotion. This is beautiful. The younglings chattered happily. One offered her a flower to keep. Annie took it carefully, marveling at how it felt alive in her palm, warm and humming with gentle energy. When she returned to the clinic, Drathis was waiting. He still came to her each evening, maintaining the bond they had built. But something was different today. His posture held new confidence. His eyes showed peace Annie had not seen before. You look better, she said, approaching to run her hand along his scales. Drathis rumbled, that sound of contentment Annie loved. Then he did something he had never done before. He shared a memory that was not from his past but from his present. Annie saw herself through his eyes, saw how she moved through the sanctuary, helping without expecting gratitude, caring without demanding affection, saw herself the way Drathis saw her, as someone who had given him back not just his freedom but his sense of self. The memory shifted, showed her Earth, green and blue and familiar, showed her family, her grandmother who had passed 2 years ago but who Drathis remembered from Annie's own memories, showed her making the choice that felt right, not the choice others expected. You want me to decide? Annie said softly. Stay or go. Drathis touched his head to hers. The meaning was clear. Either choice was acceptable. Either choice was an act of freedom. He would understand. Annie spent that night walking the floating islands, thinking about what she wanted versus what she thought she should want. The Relief Corps needed her skills. Earth needed medical volunteers. There were thousands of conflicts across the galaxy where one person could make a difference. But there were also 43 war dragons on Verdant Deep who still struggled with their trauma. There were elder dragons trying to understand the modifications forced on their returned children. There were other species beginning to reach out, asking questions about what happened, about whether healing was possible for their own wounded. By morning, Annie had made her decision. She contacted the Relief Corps and tendered her resignation. Then she composed a message to the Galactic Council, offering her services as a consultant on rehabilitation and interspecies healing. She would stay on Verdant Deep, at least for now. She would help build something that had never existed before, a place where beings damaged by war could learn to be whole again. When she told Drathis, the dragon sang. An actual song, something the war modifications had stolen from him and that he had finally rediscovered. Other dragons joined in, their voices creating harmonies that made the Crystal Islands resonate. Annie stood among them, this family she had found in the strangest way imaginable, and felt something settle in her chest. She was exactly where she was meant to be. 3 years later, Annie would watch from that same crystal platform as a delegation from Earth arrived. The War Dragon Rehabilitation Program had become famous, drawing interest from medical professionals and diplomats across the galaxy. Her methods were being studied and replicated. Laws were changing. Species were talking to each other about how they treated sentient beings. But on this day, with rain falling and young dragons playing and Drathis sleeping peacefully beside her, Annie simply enjoyed the moment. She had climbed the war dragon that no warrior could reach, and in doing so had discovered something profound. Sometimes the greatest act of courage is not fighting. Sometimes it is simply reaching out to touch another's wounds and saying, I see you. I will help if I can. You are not alone. The dragons sang their evening song. Annie hummed along, her voice small but steady among theirs. And on Verdant Deep, healing continued, one gentle touch at a time. The ground shook with each step the creature took. Annie Frost pressed herself against the overturned medical transport, her hands still gripping the supply kit she had managed to salvage before everything went wrong. Dust filled the air so thick she could taste it, and somewhere in that choking cloud something massive was breathing. She had seen war dragons before, but only in recordings. Everyone in the Galactic Relief Corps watched the footage during training, learning which battlefields to avoid and which species used what weapons. The Kryn Empire favored their bioengineered monsters above all else. Living tanks, some called them. Others had less polite names. This one was close. Too close. Annie had been a medical volunteer for 8 months. She treated burns and broken bones, delivered supplies to refugee camps, and tried not to think too hard about the politics behind each conflict. Her job was simple: help whoever needed it, regardless of which side they fought for. That philosophy had served her well until today, when her convoy took a wrong turn and drove straight into active combat. The other volunteers were dead. Annie had checked. She did not let herself think about their faces or remember their names. Not yet, survival first, grief later. That was the rule. Through a gap in the twisted metal, she watched the dragon move. Its scales were deep red, almost black in places where old blood had dried. Scars covered every visible surface. Some wounds looked fresh, still weeping fluid that hissed when it hit the ground. The creature limped, favoring its left side. Something was embedded in its shoulder, a piece of shrapnel or broken weapon glinting in the fading light. The dragon stopped moving. Its head swung toward her hiding spot, and Annie felt her heart stop. Eyes like molten gold fixed on the wreckage. Steam rose from its nostrils. This close, she could see the intelligence in those eyes, the awareness. This was not just an animal, but it did not attack. After a long moment, the dragon turned away and continued its uneven path across the battlefield. Annie waited until the footsteps faded before she moved. Her training took over. Check surroundings, assess threats, find safe route to extraction point. The problem was that extraction point no longer existed. The communications tower was slag. The emergency beacon in her kit blinked uselessly, unable to connect with any network. She was alone on a hostile world with no way home. The Kryn found her at dawn. Their patrol moved with military precision, weapons ready, scanning the wreckage. Annie stood slowly, hands raised, her medical insignia clearly visible on her vest. Shooting medical personnel violated at least 6 different galactic treaties, though she was not sure the Kryn cared much about treaties. Their commander was tall, even for his species. Kryn physiology favored dense muscle and thick hide, evolutionary advantages from their high-gravity homeworld. This one had decorations covering his armor, marks of rank and achievement. He looked at Annie the way someone might look at a minor inconvenience. "Human," he said in accented but clear standard language. "You are in restricted combat zone." "My convoy was attacked," Annie replied, keeping her voice steady. "I need to contact the relief corps." "That is not possible. You are now prisoner until your status is determined." He gestured to 2 soldiers who moved forward to take her arms. Annie did not resist. Resistance would be pointless. They brought her to a compound carved into a canyon wall. Temporary structures dotted the area, military efficiency evident in every placement. Soldiers moved between buildings with purpose. Equipment was stacked in precise rows. At the far end of the canyon, separated from everything else by a wall of energy barriers and guard posts, Annie saw him. The dragon from the battlefield. He was even larger than she had realized. His bulk filled the entire back section of the canyon. Heavy chains secured his legs to anchor points drilled deep into rock. More chains wrapped his neck and torso. He lay still, his breathing labored and painful to hear. "That is Drathis," said a voice behind her. Annie turned to find a Kryn medic, identifiable by the green markings on his uniform. The Crimson Storm, greatest war dragon in the fleet. Or he was until he went mad. "Mad?" Annie asked. "He attacks anyone who approaches. 3 handlers dead, 7 wounded. We cannot treat his injuries. We cannot mount him for combat. Commander Torn wishes to destroy him, but High Command refuses. Too valuable, they say." The medic shook his head. "Valuable corpse, more like." Annie looked back at the dragon. Even from this distance, she could see the infection spreading across his scales, the unnatural angle of one wing, the way he held himself against the pain. No wonder he attacked. He was suffering, and everyone who approached him either wanted to use him or gave up too quickly to help. "What happened to him?" she asked. 20 years of warfare happened. Drathis has fought in 43 major campaigns. The modifications we make to war dragons are extensive. Sometimes the body breaks down. Sometimes the mind does. The medic studied her with curious eyes. "Why does a human care?" Annie did not answer. She watched Drathis shift position slightly, a movement that clearly cost him effort. His golden eyes opened for a moment, scanning the compound before closing again. She was a prisoner here with no way home and no way to help herself. But maybe, just maybe, she could help someone else. The idea was probably stupid. It was definitely dangerous. Every logical part of her brain said to keep her head down and wait for